I'm a journalist. At least, that's what I tell myself when I look in the mirror every morning. Lately, though, I felt like a fraud. My words have dried up. There are barely enough ideas to keep me afloat. Deadlines are a looming shadow, and my editor's polite emails about needing a new article have become less polite, more urgent. The truth is, I'm stuck. Mentally, creatively. I needed something, anything, to shake things up. That's when I found the listing for the cottage. It was nestled on the edge of a forest, about a 2-hour drive from the city. Perfect for writers seeking inspiration, the ad said. It sounded like exactly what I needed. A change of scenery, some fresh air, and, most importantly, no distractions. I booked it impulsively, hoping the quiet solitude would bring my thoughts back to life. The cottage itself was quaint, almost charming in its rustic simplicity. It had been unoccupied for years, but the owners assured me everything was in working order. When I arrived, the air was crisp, and the smell of pine lingered in the breeze. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the nearby woods, which stretched out for miles, dense and dark. At first, it felt promising. I sat at the wooden desk by the window, overlooking the forest, waiting for inspiration to strike. But as the hours dragged on, my fingers hovered uselessly over the keyboard. Nothing came. I ventured into the woods the next afternoon. It was peaceful at first, with the sunlight filtering through the leaves, creating patterns on the forest floor. But as I went deeper, that peaceful feeling shifted. The trees grew denser, their branches gnarled, almost clutching at the air. The further I walked, the quieter it became, as if the forest was swallowing the sound. Even the wind seemed to die down. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, I realized I was lost. My phone had no signal and every direction looked the same. Just trees, an ocean of them. I tried to retrace my steps, but it was as if the forest was shifting around me. The paths that seemed familiar were gone, swallowed up by new clusters of trees. That's when I first noticed it, the faintest sound, almost like breathing, but too deep, too slow to be human. I told myself it was just the wind, but something about it was wrong. It had a rhythm, a presence, like someone or something was just beyond my sight, watching, waiting. I hurried back, heart racing, but the forest felt like it was closing in on me. The trees thicker, darker. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon the edge of the woods, the clearing where my cottage stood a welcome sight. I rushed inside, bolting the door behind me, laughing nervously at my paranoia. It was just a walk. I was overreacting. But that night, as I sat at the desk, trying again to write, the sound returned. It wasn't inside the house, but it was close. I could hear it faintly from the woods. That same slow, deliberate breathing. The wind wasn't blowing, yet the trees outside my window seemed to sway, as if something was moving through them. I stared out into the darkness, but nothing stirred. And yet, that sound persisted, like the forest itself was alive, watching me. The next day, I told myself I needed to go back into the woods, to face whatever it was that had unsettled me the day before. I packed a small bag and headed out, determined to walk the same path as before. The deeper I went, the stronger that feeling became, that I wasn't alone. The forest felt different this time, less natural. There was a silence that pressed in on me, heavy and unnatural. The birds were gone, no rustling of animals, just that thick, suffocating quiet. Then I saw it. It moved slowly, deliberately, between the trunks, just at the edge of my vision. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, too sharp. I could only make out its outline, a dark silhouette blending into the forest, but it was there. I didn't move, couldn't. My legs felt rooted to the spot, just like the trees around me. That slow breathing, the same one I'd heard the day before, filled the air again, closer now. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them. It was observing me, studying. Then it shifted. At first, it was subtle. The dark, twisted silhouette seemed to ripple, almost as if the shadows themselves were unraveling. But the movement grew faster, more frantic, until the form began to break apart. What I thought was its body started to splinter into fragments, peeling away in the air like smoke caught in the wind. And that's when I saw them, crows. Dozens of them. No, a whole swarm. They burst forth from the place where the creature had stood, feathers black as night, wings beating so fast they blurred together into a single undulating mass. Their cawing filled the forest, a chaotic, ear-splitting screech that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. I barely had time to raise my arms in defense before the flock surrounded me, wings flapping against my skin, sharp beaks cutting through the air. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was as if the forest had come alive, and now it was swallowing me whole. The crows whipped around me, faster and faster, a storm of feathers and noise, until it stopped. Everything stopped. I stumbled backward, bracing myself against a tree, gasping for air. When I looked up, the crows were gone. The forest was still. Too still. The world felt wrong, like time had stuttered, leaving me standing in a place that was no longer real. The trees were the same, but they looked different somehow, more distant. The clearing was unfamiliar, as though I had never set foot here before. I turned, trying to get my bearings, to find the way back. But the path, the one I had come down only minutes earlier, was gone. No footprints, no broken branches, just an endless stretch of trees, stretching in every direction. I walked, retracing my steps in my mind, but it was useless. Every path led me deeper into the forest, further from any place I recognized. The more I searched, the more the landscape seemed to twist, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. Every tree looked the same, every clearing a mirror of the last. I don't know how long I wandered, but the sinking feeling that I was trapped grew stronger with every passing minute. The road, the cottage, the way back to any semblance of safety, it was all gone, replaced by this endless maze of trees. The sound of the breathing was faint, but steady. It slipped between the trees, barely louder than the rustle of leaves, but I couldn't mistake it. Whatever it was, whatever had turned into that flock of crows, was still out there, still waiting. I shivered and turned in every direction, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The forest seemed endless, an unbroken line of shadows and trees that stretched forever. I couldn't tell if I was moving toward the breathing or away from it. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to focus. The cottage wasn't far, or at least it shouldn't have been. I'd only come a short way into the woods. I just needed to find the road, follow it back to safety. But no matter how hard I tried to remember, the details slipped away, like a dream you can't fully grasp when you wake up. I started walking faster, pushing through the thick underbrush. Every step felt like I was getting farther from where I wanted to be. The trees loomed overhead, their branches tangled in dark patterns that blocked out most of the sky. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement, just at the edge of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing, just the forest. And that breathing, it was closer now. I stumbled into a small clearing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stood there trying to calm down, to think clearly. The crows were gone, and the creature, whatever it was, had disappeared. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded, led deeper into the woods. I pulled out my phone again, hoping for a signal. Nothing. Just the dark, empty screen reflecting my tired face. I cursed under my breath and shoved it back into my pocket. Then, without warning, the forest around me seemed to shift. The trees bent in strange, unnatural ways, their trunks twisting as though they were being pulled by invisible hands. The ground felt unstable beneath my feet, as if the earth itself was rippling like water. I blinked, trying to steady myself, but the landscape refused to hold still. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining it, stress playing tricks on my mind, but then the shadows began to stretch, growing long and thin, reaching for me. I backed away, fear gripping me tight. The breathing, it was louder now, impossibly close. I spun around, ready to run, but the forest had changed again. The path I'd just come down was gone, swallowed by trees that hadn't been there before. I was trapped, and that's when I saw them, figures moving through the woods. At first, I thought they were people, maybe hikers or locals, but the way they moved, it wasn't human. They slipped between the trees, silent and quick, their bodies tall and elongated, with limbs too thin and sharp, like they were made of shadows. They didn't make a sound, not even the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. My heart raced. I couldn't move. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the faint sunlight that managed to filter through the branches. I could feel their gaze on me, even though I couldn't see their eyes. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then one of them stepped forward, its body shifting as it approached. The closer it came, the more its form seemed to change, its outline blurring like smoke caught in the wind, just like the creature from before. I stumbled backward, but my foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the air rushing from my lungs as I hit the ground. I scrambled to get back up, but by the time I was on my feet, the figure was gone. The forest was silent again, too silent. I stood there, shaking, trying to figure out what had just happened. But the moment I tried to piece it together, the memory of the figures started to slip away, like water draining through my fingers. I couldn't remember what they'd looked like, or how many there had been. I couldn't even remember the sound of their movement. All I knew was that something was wrong with this place, something beyond my understanding. I turned in circles, searching for any sign of the path I'd come down, but there was nothing, just trees in every direction. My sense of time was gone. I didn't know how long I'd been out there, wandering. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had to get back to the cottage. I couldn't stay here, not in the dark. I started walking again, this time faster, not caring if I made noise, not caring where I was going. I just needed to move. But no matter how far I went, no matter how many twists and turns I took, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was shifting around me, keeping me trapped inside. And then I realized I wasn't hearing the breathing anymore. I stopped, listening. Nothing, just the wind moving through the branches. But that silence, that heavy, oppressive silence, was still there, pressing down on me like a weight. That's when I saw it. Just ahead, through a gap in the trees, a light. My heart leapt. The cottage. It had to be. I broke into a run, pushing through the branches, my chest burning, my legs aching. The light grew brighter as I got closer, flickering through the trees like a beacon. But when I finally stumbled out into the clearing, gasping for breath, I froze. It wasn't the cottage. It was something else entirely. A fire burning in the middle of the clearing. And standing around it, silhouetted by the flames, were figures, tall, thin, with long, shadowed limbs. They didn't move. They didn't look at me, but I knew they'd been waiting for me to come back. The figures stood there, their tall, shadowy forms flickering in the firelight. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them, frozen in place. I wanted to run, to turn back and escape into the woods, but something held me there, something deeper than fear. It was like the forest itself had wrapped its roots around me, keeping me locked in that moment. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped closer to the fire. Its shape shifted, becoming more defined, and though it had no clear face, I felt its eyes on me. The air around me grew thick, heavy, as though the very trees were listening. "You do not belong here," a voice said. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. It was deeper, a whisper that seemed to rise from the ground itself, carried on the wind. The voice was ancient, layered, as if many were speaking at once, both near and far. I tried to speak, but no words came out. "You are not one of us," the voice continued. "This place is not yours. Leave." The figures didn't move any closer. They didn't need to. The message was clear, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of something, regret, maybe, or warning. I couldn't quite place it, but it felt like they had given me a chance. Like this was the only warning I'd get. I swallowed hard, nodding without thinking. My legs, which had been frozen moments ago, felt lighter, as if the grip of the forest was loosening. The figures stayed by the fire, watching me silently. And then the trees shifted. I could hardly believe my eyes, but the forest moved. The trees, those massive ancient trunks, twisted and bent as if rearranging themselves, opening a narrow path through the dense woods. A trail. It stretched out before me, leading into the darkness, away from the clearing. I didn't wait. I turned and started walking, my steps quick and unsteady at first, but soon I was moving with purpose, following the trail that seemed to guide me. The air felt lighter now. The oppressive weight that had surrounded me lifted. Behind me, the flickering light of the fire grew dimmer, until it was swallowed by the trees entirely. The path was clearer than I expected, the ground firm beneath my feet. As I walked, the breathing, the constant presence that had haunted me, faded into nothingness. It was just me, the wind, and the crunch of leaves underfoot. I don't know how long I walked, but eventually, the forest began to thin. The trees grew further apart, and the shadows weren't so deep anymore. I could see a faint glow through the branches, and my heart leapt. The cottage. I stepped out of the woods and into the open clearing, and there it was. The small, familiar shape of the cottage stood just ahead, its windows reflecting the last light of the setting sun. I was back. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it, unable to believe I'd found my way out. But the path was gone now. The trail that had led me out had vanished, swallowed by the forest, as if it had never existed. The forest was silent behind me, but I could still feel it watching. Always watching. I didn't waste any more time. I hurried to the cottage, my hand shaking as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The warmth of the small room a welcome relief. I had escaped, for now. But as I sat there, trying to collect my thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The forest had let me go, but it hadn't forgotten. And I knew, deep down, that I wasn't supposed to return. Back inside the cottage, I collapsed onto the old wooden chair by the desk, still trembling from what had just happened. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with a strange energy, like the woods had followed me inside somehow. But despite the fear still clinging to me, something else had settled in the back of my mind. A thought, or maybe a feeling. I was alive. I had just walked out of something that I couldn't fully explain, something ancient and terrifying. But I was here. Somehow, that realization broke through the fog that had been clouding my mind for weeks. I sat there, staring at the blank page on my laptop. The blinking cursor was no longer a mocking reminder of my failure. Instead, it felt like an invitation. The words that had refused to come before, the ideas that had slipped through my fingers, they were all there now, swirling in my mind like the leaves in that forest. I opened a new document, and before I knew it, my fingers were moving. Words spilled out onto the screen, fast and unfiltered, like I was trying to capture something that had been waiting just beneath the surface all along. The story of the forest, the figures, the crows. It all poured out of me, raw and vivid. But it wasn't just the fear. No, it was something more than that. The forest had shown me something. A truth, maybe, or a glimpse into something beyond the ordinary. I wasn't just writing another article to meet a deadline. This was different. For the first time in years, I was writing because I needed to, because there was something inside me that demanded to be put into words. I lost track of time as I wrote, the hours slipping away unnoticed. The dread that had hung over me like a shadow since the day I arrived was still there, but it had transformed into something else, something I could use. I realized then that this place, this strange, haunted corner of the world, had given me exactly what I'd been searching for, though not in the way I expected. I wasn't trapped in my routine anymore. The writer's block, the suffocating deadlines, the pressure to churn out article after article. It all seemed distant now, almost irrelevant. The experience in the forest had torn open something inside me, pushing me beyond the safe boundaries I'd been operating within for so long. It had forced me to look at the world differently, to see the hidden, the strange, the things that exist just out of sight. And that's what I wanted to write about now. By the time I looked up from the screen, the sun had fully set, and the cottage was bathed in the warm glow of the lamps. I had written more in those few hours than I had in weeks. But it wasn't just the quantity, it was the quality. For the first time, I wasn't worried about what my editor would think, or whether the article would get the clicks and shares I needed to survive. I was writing for myself, for the pure need to tell the story. Felt like I'd broken free of something. I wasn't just a journalist anymore, stuck in the grind of daily assignments. I was a storyteller again. The words weren't work. They were a way out, a way to reconnect with something deeper inside me. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, I'd have to leave this cottage, go back to the city, face my life. But for now, I wasn't worried about that. I had found my voice again, my purpose, and I owed it all to the forest. It had scared me, unsettled me in ways I couldn't fully describe, but it had also awakened something. It had shown me that there were still stories out there, hidden just beyond the surface of the everyday world, waiting to be told. As I sat there, staring at the blinking cursor once more, I felt a strange sense of peace. The breathing, the crows, the figures in the trees. It had all given me something I hadn't known I was missing. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid to write. I was ready, and I knew deep down that this was just the beginning.